So very briefly, I know that a newspaper is a very old-fashioned thing now, so maybe this doesn't look like the most appropriate thing to hold up, because most of what you get in newspapers now has shifted into an online format, but it's still a useful guide to help you get your head around why it is that journalists write the way they do, as opposed to academics. So when you write a paper, you're writing the headline or you're writing the length of paper. You're not restricted by any spatial constraints, really. You have to just write until you've got the whole idea there. You write until you're done writing. So you have to make sure, if it takes you 15 pages or 30 pages to get your whole idea there fleshed out and explained and justified, you do that, and then you get it peer reviewed. In journalism, you have, if you want your story on the front page, you only have, say, space for 5 stories. So you have to keep your story very short, very tight to squash into that space. It's frustrating from a scientist's perspective because you can only limit, you have such a limit on what you get to say in such a short space. But it's very good because it forces you to be incredibly disciplined. So when people in the media talk about space, about how long a story should be, we're literally talking, say, 500 to 700 words for an article. So this paper is probably 18,000 words, and it's 23 pages. Now imagine you have to reduce that to 700 words to squeeze onto the front of this. So the tools we're going to use today is the process of how to do that. Okay. There are 2 specific story formats that I mentioned in the manual, and which apply to how you can take your information and turn it into any format for a popular audience. So I'm not asking you to think that you're now going to start writing news stories. I'm asking you to take what we're going to learn about what a news story is and how to write it. And it just helps you to refine your thinking so that you can take your information, change the way you render that information, and then you can, whether you're giving it the information to someone else through a 60-second video interview or radio interview, if you're doing it in a blog, in a press release or a resource pack, or even talking at a workshop. The processes you go through to write a news story is the same process you would do for any other popular format where you want to distill, clarify your message, simplify it, and use language people can access. So, what is a news story? And again, I must reiterate, you need to go and read newspaper articles regularly so you get a sense of what it is. It has a very specific tone and style. So you'll notice that compared with your academic writing, the news stories are very short. So literally 500 to 700 words. They are usually very sober. They're not sort of frivolous. There isn't humor, which is similar to how you would write. They're very factual and they're neutral. So, for instance, in a news story, you're writing as a third person observing. You're not writing yourself into the story. If you write an opinion piece, which is slightly different, so let me just to go back to the newspaper. The hard news stories that we're talking about are the kinds of stories you would find on the front of the newspaper. So they're short, third person, factual. In the inside of the newspaper, and this isn't a good example because this newspaper isn't like newspapers we have back home, but in the middle of the newspaper you often have these much bigger sections where you can have long opinion pieces where you can write in your own voice as your own expert and you can flesh out an idea. It's a slightly different way of thinking, and it's a very, very powerful way of getting your story out there and getting your idea into the public domain. And I'll give you an example of how we did that successfully in South Africa recently with the EPRI team. Just to give you an example of how valuable it is to get an opinion piece into a newspaper like this, whether it's online or in the actual hard copy. In South Africa, if you wanted to buy this page as an advert, you would pay probably 100,000 Rand, which is probably 200,000 birr. How much would that be in dollars? $10,000?
Yeah.
Yeah. You would pay $10,000 US to get access to this page. So if you, as an expert, can convince the editor of this newspaper that your opinion is worthwhile, and he gives you that page, he's giving you $10,000 worth of space. So that's how valuable it is. Okay, so a news story, okay, as I've said, it's short, it's factual. The voice is third person, so you're talking about them and they. You're not talking about second person, which is you, and you're not talking about first person, which is me, I, or we. An important thing in a news story is that the source always has to be attributed. Now, this is something that's very familiar to all of you, because you also have to attribute all of your sources when you write academics. In journalism, you do it in a slightly different way. So instead of putting your footnoted reference or your reference in the text, like in brackets with the name of the author of the journal, blah, 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 in journalism, you would say, and fishing stocks in Chile are down by so many percentages according to the Research Institute at the School of Economics or whatever. So that's how you attribute it. The tricky thing for you as an academic is you often are referring to yourself as a source. So in journalism, you are referring to another expert, an expert who's someone other than yourself. In the kind of work that you do, you are generally referring to yourself as the source. So you have to ensure that you establish your credibility. So, for instance, either if you're writing it in this hard news third-person format, or if you're doing it as an opinion piece, where you are possibly writing it in the first person, where you're saying, my research says this, I am an expert for the following reasons. You need to establish who you are, why you are credible, and why the audience should believe you. So you give the name, you give your own credentials, you give the credentials of your institution, but you also reference the study that you've done, so that you can show that your study comes from a legitimate and a reviewed perspective. Just quickly go back to this one point about the difference between, so a news story, you can also treat it as a press release or a blog. And I wanted to say one thing about a blog, because it's come up a few times today. A blog is a fantastic opportunity to put your stories online. You write it literally as if you were to write a news story, which is very similar to a press release. The thing with blogs and with writing online is that people often think, because they're no longer constrained by the physical space of the newspaper, instead of keeping their story down to 3 paragraphs, they now think, I can write it, because there's no end to the page, I can just write as long as I like. The result invariably is very undisciplined writing. So people get very sloppy and they just write lengths and lengths and lengths and lengths, not realizing that by paragraph 2, the audience is bored and they've gone off to find something else to read. So when you're writing a blog, you need to write it as if you were a news story, where we'll talk about the inverted pyramid in a minute, but where you keep the most interesting, important point at the top of the story. If your introduction doesn't grab the reader in the first 2 or 3 sentences, you might as well not bother. It's a very, very good discipline to think, okay, I have blog space, I have something important to say, but I'm going to make sure that I say it in 5 powerful, well-sculpted paragraphs. Okay. All right, so planning your article. So we've spoken several times about knowing who your audience is, and in your context, it's not your usual sort of communications context, because we've established that in many respects, the audience is not necessarily the mainstream public. The audience for a lot of you is a policymaker. And I mean, but also to give you a context of how difficult that question can be to answer, we can't assume that our policymakers have tertiary education or have a science degree or understand environment. So, and I'll give you an example. In South Africa, our sitting president doesn't have a high school education. So he's not a stupid man. He's incredibly skilled at what he does. He's just not well versed in the mythology of science. So we have multiple levels of government where, people might have high school or might have an undergrad degree, but they aren't well versed in science. So I think the good thing about the spaces that you operate in is you are fairly familiar with who your audiences are. I mean, certainly in the EPRU context, in Cape Town, the researchers have good working relationships with a lot of the stakeholders, so they kind of know who they're targeting. Like, imagine who that person is when you're putting your story together. Again, so we've talked about the medium in terms of length. When you know that you only have 500 words or 700 words, it does force you to be very disciplined in terms of how you structure your ideas, what you include and what you don't include. I know it's very frustrating for you when you have a head full of ideas. You know, you've been working on a research project for 3 years, and someone says now you have to reduce it to 5 paragraphs. I know it's very frustrating. But don't think that this is supposed to be a comprehensive overview of your work. You're just pulling out one really powerful hook that's important for this context, for this story, for this audience, for today. You have to be really concise and to the point. And the idea of lifting out your take-home messages, which is the process you went through with Cindy, the process you'll go through with me, if you have those take-home messages, 1, 2, maybe 3, if you have them at the top of your head, one day when the videographer comes to you and says, just give me this in a nutshell, you'll have it right there. And it makes it so easy for us, but it also makes it easy for you. Okay. So in terms of tone, again, try and keep it conversational. I know it's very hard to do. Sometimes what helps, if you're struggling with a sentence, read it out loud. Literally, I know it's always a little bit embarrassing to do that, but read it out loud and listen to how it sounds. And then think, how could I rewrite this so that it sounds as if I would speak it? If you have someone's spoken word of the same information rather than just taking it from a research paper, I promise you it is so much easier and more enjoyable from the reader's perspective if it sounds like someone has spoken the words rather than written them. So always, with all of your work, just try and make it more conversational. Pace. So what often happens in academic writing is you write these long sentences where you've got 5 ideas crammed into one sentence, and sometimes the sentence takes up an entire paragraph. From a reader's perspective, it is exhausting. So what we often do, Cindy, you probably do this as well, is you'll end up taking an academic sentence and you'll chop it into 3 short parts. It just picks up the pace. It makes the whole article read a hell of a lot faster, and it just becomes more interesting and quicker to get through. So just keep that in mind. We've spoken about jargon. Jargon is a fantastic verbal shorthand for when you're dealing with your colleagues, because you don't want to have to flesh out every time you talk about anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions or the albedo effect or what REDD++ is. You don't want to have to flesh that out every single time. So it's a useful shorthand for your group. But for people outside of your group, it becomes a very tribal language and it becomes exclusionary. So the more you use that kind of terminology, the more you shut out the people that you actually want to include. And the more you use that language, the more likely they are to stop reading your piece. I'm going to give a short example to try and demonstrate the tools that you need to apply shortly, and I think we're going to run out of time horribly. So in Cape Town, we have a major water crisis. We're at the end, or I wouldn't say it's the end, I wish it was the end. We are in the middle of a 3-year drought that is the worst drought in over a century. Our dams, this is a photograph of one of our dams. We literally are going to run out of water in March, and the military and the police have been put on standby in the event that we have civil unrest, because we're going to have soon we're going to reach a point where tankers deliver water to us. We can't open the taps anymore. So the EPRU, the Environmental Policy Research Unit at the School of Economics at the University of Cape Town, has been working with partners in the city of Cape Town, and it's an unusual relationship they've been able to develop. It took a long time to develop trust. It's a politically fraught space to work in, but Martine Visser and her colleagues have worked very effectively with the city to try and devise an evidence-based policy for driving voluntary behavior change amongst water users in the city of Cape Town. So there are a number of ways that one can try and get consumers to use less water. So one way is to increase the tariffs, the cost of water. Another way is to threaten people with fines. Another way is to put water meters or water devices in people's homes. So if they use too much, you shut off the water. So those are the stick measures. Other incentives, which they were testing now, was if you put positive messages into people's utility billing process, can you drive behavior change that way? So they would do things like, in people's monthly utility bills, they would say, relative to your neighborhood, you are using more or less or the same amount of water as everyone around you. And then they looked to see how people would respond. And then the other thing they did, well, there were several different messages, but another message was, if you reduce your water usage by the following amount, then we will publicly praise you on the city's website. Anyway, and so over the course of about 6 months, they did this process and they looked to see how people responded. And then they wrote this paper. So this is the paper. Behavioral Nudges for Water Conservation, Experimental Evidence from Cape Town, South Africa. So this paper is about a 36-page paper, and the word length is about 17,000 words, which is really long. I'm just going to talk you through the process that we went through. So with this paper, we needed to decide who was going to be the audience. Now, whenever I do this training with scientists, they all panic and say, we're writing for everyone. You can't write for everyone. You can either write for someone who has a high school education, or you write for someone who is an engineer, or a whole bunch of engineers, or you write for, say, technocrats with this level of knowledge. You can't write for everyone. You have to decide. So with this particular strategy, 2 options. It's a politically fraught space that we're working in, because the province and the city where this crisis is unfolding is run by the opposition party, the Democratic Alliance. The national government is run by the African National Congress, which is the Liberation Party of Nelson Mandela. The National Party and the Democratic Alliance absolutely hate each other. But the province and the city are on the receiving end of funding decisions that are made by the National Department of Water. So it's a very, very politically fraught space. We needed to, this strategy needs to target national government as well as local government. So together with the authors of this paper, we wrote up an opinion piece that went into a weekly newspaper called the Mail and Guardian, which we know is read by very intelligent readers as well as government. So we know that it reaches policymakers. But then the other strategy, which is one we have to still implement, is to target local government. So, for instance, the mayor's office, utility managers, and then the city's communication team. So the purpose is not really to get the story into the local newspapers within the Cape. I mean, it's useful, but actually we want to go directly to people who have immediate influence over water utility management in the city. The idea is once the information is repackaged into a popular format, it can be used for verbal face-to-face workshop type interactions, for television or radio, for a press release or a news story, or for a resource pack. And I think, having looked at a lot of the papers that we are working with at this, in this process, a lot of those papers would be excellent to turn into resource packs. Okay, so some examples of language that is not conversational. I just highlighted these from the paper. So here's an example. Water usage becomes a de facto unobservable characteristic, receiving less weighting than other preferences. Oops, okay, that's telling me to shut up. Okay, consumers are not responsive to price signals when price information is unclear and the pricing system is complex. This is particularly true of water where, 1, conventionally metered consumers pay for water ex post and not at the instance of usage. Now, if you're familiar with newspaper articles, you know you would never read language like that in a newspaper article. Okay, I'm not going to give you an example of how this particular phrase is rewritten because we don't have time. I just wanted to highlight that for you. So when you read your own papers, just think, like, would I read that specific phrasing if I were reading this in a newspaper? And then think, okay, so how could I say exactly the same thing, but in a much more conversational way? Okay, active versus passive voice. This isn't something you need to get too caught up on because the editors who work with you can actually make this, this change quite easily. But in science, often you use the passive voice rather than the active voice. What I mean by that, the active voice is, fun was had by all. If you say the active voice, you have a strong, powerful agent at the beginning of the sentence saying that agent did something. So instead of saying fun was had by all, you say I had fun, or we had fun, or you had fun. So this is an example of a passive voice. The impact of information provision and feedback on residential water consumption is tested with emphasis on. Rather, you would say, we tested the impact of information provision, blah, blah, blah. It's a subtle shift. Journalists go absolutely nuts if you use the passive voice. Okay, so jargon. A couple of examples of jargon that came out of this paper. social norm treatment versus intrinsic motivation treatment versus social recognition treatment versus public good treatment. I don't know if those are terms that any of you might recognize. This is from a very specific area of behavioral economics. Even the word behavioral nudges, which is, second language to people like Martina and herself, a lot of people outside of behavioral economics have never heard of that. People don't even know what behavioral economics is. I had to have it explained to me. Again, levels of detail. So Pete had a very nice description of what we're trying to achieve through the popular rendering of stories. He said, people want to watch the movie. They don't want to know how you made the movie. Obviously, it's really important that you convince your reader that the movie was made well. So you do want people to know that your methodology was strong, but you just simply don't have the time or space to go into detailed explanation of what your methodology is. So, for instance, levels of detail where you're using equations, that kind of thing, you just can't include that. So this is a very simple example. I mean, some of the papers some of your papers that I read had much more complicated levels of detail. Unfortunately, you just have to. From a journalistic popular perspective, if you point back to the fact that this is peer-reviewed science, then your reader will trust that the methodology is solid. It's very important when you're planning your story and trying to lift out the information that you include in that story, you need to have a hook or an angle. So what is the one thing in the story that is going to hook the fish? What is new or interesting? What is the one thing that makes this bit of research relevant now? So that is usually going to become your introduction to your news story. So it just helps to think, and bearing in mind, I mean, Danielle, you were saying there are too many take-home messages in my story about ticks. I completely get that, and I can see why you feel that way. So try to think of this. You're not trying to summarize your entire paper. You're trying to lift out one really strong, so if you have one bullet to hit at a target, what would be the one bullet in the story that would make it relevant for now? You can do another story tomorrow with a different angle, another story the next day with a different angle. What's the one bullet? So basically, if you could think, what is because there's probably a lot of research in an area. What makes this bit of research, what's new and interesting? What's new and interesting? It is hard. The thing you want to ask is the so what question. This isn't going to be your angle or your hook. It's not going to be in your introduction, but this helps you understand why the story is relevant right now. So ask the so what question. What makes this story important or relevant to this audience in this sort of time and political context? I don't mean specifically this moment of this day, but why now, this year? Why is this issue or story or finding important and relevant to this audience? If you can flesh that out, that also helps you to frame the story. What is the take-home message? It might be your introduction or your angle, but it might not be. So what is your take-home message? It could be a call to action. And given that we are communicating to policymakers, it might actually be useful to have a call to action. Tell them what they need to do as a result of your finding. And then the 5 W's and an H. This is an old journalistic skill. Who did what, when, where, why, and how. It's like journalism 101. It's kindergarten level writing, but it is very useful. If you're struggling to lift out the important nuggets, that process is quite useful. Okay, so in the context of the story I've just told you about, the angle or the hook is, so what is new or interesting in this finding? This was really interesting, I thought. They found that in terms of, so they sent 9 different messages out in all of the utility bills, either threatening people to cut their water off, threatening people to fine them, threatening to charge them more for water, or telling them if they were behaving nicely or not, or offering to put their names on the city's website. The biggest, most powerful response was when people were told that they would be publicly praised for reducing their water use. They responded very well. So in the city of, in this context, rich people use huge amounts of water, poor people use almost nothing. So putting up the price of water, even if you have a tiered structure, rich people still don't feel it because it's such a tiny percentage of their household budget. So you can charge them 10 times the amount of water, but they're still going to fill up their swimming pools, they don't care. But if you publicly praise them, they'll stop using water. So it's an ego-driven response. That was a very interesting finding. And they found that, and because they're the biggest water users, that's where you want to have the most impact. So that was an interesting finding. The so what question, again, I've alluded to the environmental and the political context, but South Africa and Cape Town, in the worst drought in over a century, the city had already tried price hikes and threats of fines, the stick approach. It wasn't necessarily getting as strong a response as they needed. Now they wanted to see whether a carrot approach would work. So they already had the data, they'd done lots of research around this, so they spent 6 months getting research and data around that. And that's essentially what the paper was about, showing the findings from this new 6-month research. So the take-home messages: city utility managers should tell the public that if their water usage drops, they will have their names published on the city's website. City utility managers should also include positive messaging in the monthly utility bills, but that they should also combine it with the stick approaches. So don't not replace it, but combine it with. So there's a very clear instruction. So these city utility managers are your policy makers. You already have a really good relationship because you've been doing this research in consultation with them for about 2 years, and they actually want to hear your findings. So essentially, there is your call to action, that's your instruction. Very clear, very simple. So we're talking about pyramids. This is a diagram of generally the model of how you structure a news story. There's an old-fashioned reason why it is. It has to do with the fact that stories are laid out like this, and you don't have a lot of time to re-edit the story if it runs too long. So in the old days, the editor would just say, you need to write your story in such a way that if I don't have space for the last 3 paragraphs, if I don't have space for the last 3 paragraphs, I can just cut that off the bottom of the story without losing any of the meaning up there. I don't have time to send it back to you to rewrite it. So that's why hard news is written in the inverted pyramid. Why this is such a good way of rendering information is, now imagine that you have got half an hour in the morning over coffee to quickly read through the newspaper or scan it on the internet. You're just going to scan the headline and you're going to scan the first paragraph. And if it catches your interest, you'll open the door and walk in and read the whole story. If not, you'll move on. But you might also just be able to get the basic gist of it at the top. So it's a very good way of structuring your story so that even if the person can only read the first 3 paragraphs, at least they are getting the gist of it. So your introduction is going to be 1 or 2 sentences that includes your angle or your hook. So the person reads that and you grab them and then you pull them into the rest of the story. The most important, the rest of them, so, and then sort of in descending order of importance, you decide what is the next most important information and you put it there, and then you can start filling in the padding it with the additional useful detail. So just keep this in mind, the inverted pyramid. Okay, so this is an example of the op-ed piece, the opinion piece that went into the Mail and Guardian as a result of Martine and her colleagues' stories. So remember the original title of the paper was Behavioral Nudges for Water Conservation, Experimental Evidence from Cape Town, South Africa. The article for the newspaper was Public Praise Drives Water-Wise Behavior, a Lesson for City Managers. This is a little bit long for your standard newspaper headline, but we were able to get away with it. And then the introduction reads like this. Applauding people publicly for their successful efforts to reduce water use at home may be an effective means to drive water-wise behavior across a city. So because this is a national newspaper, we're talking about cities in general, not specific to Cape Town. This kind of positive messaging by city utility managers can work alongside other methods that are traditionally used to drive demand-side water conservation measures among households, such as water restrictions and tariff increases. This is what researchers from the University of Cape Town found after a 6-month experiment using behavioral nudges amongst household water consumers in the city during the drought last summer. And then a short sentence explaining what behavioral nudges are. Okay, so that just gives you an example of what the environmental and political context was that we were working in, the research that was conducted, the scientific paper that was produced as a result, the very deliberate process of applying these journalistic tools to that information and then rendering it like this.